Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to thank you for joining us this afternoon for our live webcast in joint collaboration with our partner, IBM. In today's session, we will be focusing on DevOps continuous testing and looking at how service virtualization can support your organization to increase your ROI. The presentation will be 40 minutes and plus a Q&A at the end of the session. Before I pass you over to my colleague, Stefan, please feel free to type in your questions on your Q&A pod now or during the presentation. We will try to reply to all or most of your questions if time permits. A full screen option is also available at the top of your screen if you need to use this full screen option. So without further delay, I now pass you over to my colleague, Stefan, who will introduce our speakers. Stefan?
Good afternoon all, Stefan Dedil speaking. I'm the Business Development Executive and Global Leader on Service Virtualization at Testhouse, and it's with pleasure that I will be chairing the presentation today. We will have a few presentations along the journey. The first one will be around DevOps that I will take care of, followed by a bit of discussion regarding Service Virtualization, and finally we'll discuss a bit about Testhouse and how we can help in that area. With Shug Suhadafan, who is our CEO and founder of Testhouse. Okay, what is important to understand about DevOps is we're trying to take today, the presentation is about the management perspective or management views. In 2 weeks from now, we'll have one which will be a lot more technical about the technology. But for today, I will try to stay at a higher level to give you the ground and the basic of the DevOps and the service virtualization and how it can improve your quality of your software you produced, and also time to delivery and also cost efficiency. So if you talk about the software delivery, if we look at the C-suite people in their organization, 86% of them want to have a better software delivery capabilities, but in fact only 25% are moving in that direction. And out of these 25%, about two-thirds, or if not three-quarters of them, have better results for quality and customer satisfaction than if you would not take that approach. And there are many reasons why people will not go with our DevOps. It could be scare of change, and that we will see a little bit later in the process. And when we talk about DevOps, again, it's not only about technology and tool set, but it's also about process and about people. So it's a bit more complex to do, and it's a lot more advanced than what we call agile technology, which is pretty much the basic part of DevOps for development. But when we put the ops part in place and the business leaders, then it becomes a whole business challenge to be able to handle. If we look now in the Analyst Reports, the IDC predicted that by 2015, 60% of CIO will use DevOps as a primary tool to address the speed of mobile, cloud, and open source. In our view, I don't think we are at 60% yet. I think we are more around, as we said, about the 25 to 30% who are adopting it. But there is a lot of little areas of companies where they do proof of concept about this new approach, which required IT and business transformation. If we look at the Gartner prediction, is that change is the new normal. So there is more and more pressure now from executives to change faster to please clients and be ahead of competition. And the pressure will continue to be on in order to accelerate delivery with quality. The DevOps from Forrester is promoting that DevOps will ensure that you'll have quality delivery at a faster pace, and also with cost efficiency. And we will see some ROI analysis and business cases when we will go toward the service virtualization part of the presentation. The expectation continues to increase here. We see two lines about what is the status quo and where we are going in the near future in many organizations. So on the red line is the opportunity cost that will increase in time because you spend more time developing it. And on the green line will be the quality that you have a number of defects that remain in the system. And the idea is to find a just balance between two. So as you see in the past, The organization were taking a bit more time to be able to develop, and if you look in the right one, we're moving toward the left in order to accelerate development, and we need to do that faster. This is why having process to do that DevOps or that automation is so essential in order to accelerate the delivery. The other reality we have is if we talk about testing labor, there is more and more application being demanded. There is a lot of pressure from organization to go toward IT. A lot of organizations, in fact, are calling themselves IT organization, including banks. So which means that there is a lot more application, a lot more software involvement, and bigger investment in the IT organization of the company. And therefore, the number of testing experienced people continue to increase as in development, and that there is create a rarity in the market, and the price increase. And also, if you look at offshoring and outsourcing from India or China or Malaysia, you will see that the rates are still growing pretty rapidly at the moment. And at the end of the day, the only way to be able to cut that rapidly is by automating and using tools instead of developing everything internally or finding resources. And that's an area of consideration. The test lab complexity now with all these various public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud, online mainframe and server, and all the APIs and all the communication protocol, it just become a big complex environment to test in. And if you need to maintain that environment, that will cost you arms and legs. And this is where service virtualization can make a huge difference. The last one is about development velocity. You need to stay ahead of your competition and be able to move application as fast as you can. And this is where the technology can assist you and the methodology. The usual approach is, before, was to go toward what we call the Big Bang, which was more of the waterfall approach, where you would just develop everything and regroup it all together, and then with the Big Bang integration, you do the testing, you find your bugs, and you debug at that point. But if you look at the price of debugging these found bugs, if you find any problem at unit testing, it's about 16 pounds, according to some analysis. At integration testing, it's 97. If you look at the Big Bang one, it's about 290 pounds, and if you wait to be in the production, it could be over 1,000 to debug. And it just comes from the complexity of going back in the process and figure out where the problem is and where it is from. So the whole idea is if we can test earlier and better and more regularly, then suddenly you start generating substantial improvement in the velocity, but also in the quality, and at the end, it's for sure the cost efficiency. There will be a change in the role of the tester in organization. And traditional tester used to be more involved in UI testing, executing testing framework, and acceptance testing, while the development guys were also doing some type of testing through their code development, and they were more involved in developing coding for performance testing, unit testing, and building testing framework. In the new approach of the DevOps, the continuous testing will require development tester that will be expert in performance testing, in integration testing, but also in service virtualization in order to have a better grasp on the complex environment. Now, before we go to the next slide, which will, our next slide is about the DevOps and the will of DevOps. The whole thing about DevOps is, if you start from the top, it's required continuous business planning, where the business leader will define what the market needs and will feed that information in an agile way to the development team and the testing team. And that testing team will do their best to test and develop rapidly various features and various increments of them, and release several times during a week. And the whole idea is to deploy that to the market, to the production. And this is where, when we talk about Agile versus DevOps, it makes a difference. When you were in Agile and not DevOps, it will get stuck at deployment, and the number of new features will get stuck and will not be deployed on time. But if you adopt the DevOps, then suddenly you have the whole wheel working properly and in the right collaboration, and that's what DevOps will bring to your organization. Then we go to operate, which is pretty much the operation that will make sure that the system is working properly, and we'll get feedback from the customer, which feedback the information to the business planning and business leader to be able to go for the next round. And if you do that regularly and rapidly, you'll stay ahead of your competition, and the system will be in place with more features, at a lower cost, and more rapidly to the market. I can introduce Nick Blamey. Nick is worldwide technical sales, part of the testing and quality group at IBM Hybrid Cloud Software, and he will be taking the next part of the presentation for about 20 minutes, and then we will jump to continue the agenda with the remaining part of the presentation. Welcome, Nick.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nick Blamey speaking. Yeah, fantastic. I'm just looking at the results, and I'll analyse those while I can, we can deliver the message back to the audience. I'll just introduce myself quickly. So I work for, Stefan said, for IBM in the software group, a new division of IBM, which is called Hybrid Cloud, and we work in the DevOps organisation within the Hybrid Cloud brand within IBM. A little bit about myself. I've been in the testing space now for 20 years, mainly looking at test automation. I've watched the market change over the years from the old 90s, where it was all to do with client-server testing and call center type applications, and then came the web, and then obviously we've now got mobile applications. There's not really been that much innovation in the testing area. We've seen capabilities like test automation and defect management and then load testing. But the only real new innovation around testing in terms of solutions which enable DevOps has been around service virtualization. So at the beginning of 2012, IBM acquired a British organization. It's very great to see British innovation in these very high-tech areas. It was a company called Green Hat, they were basically a group of middleware consultants who did a lot of work in the City of London, helping major trading organizations, banks who have trading platforms and payment systems to deploy very mission-critical middleware solutions and de-risk those deployments. And they began as consultants delivering those services. They then realized during that work with some of these majorly mission-critical organizations with mission-critical applications that the biggest challenge was the testing and the de-risking and speeding of the testing of those middleware applications. So they built an in-house solution to help customers. And then the organization evolved from being a consultancy-led organization into a tool-based organization. And IBM acquired that solution in 2012. It's been one of the most successful acquisitions IBM has ever made. As some of you may know, IBM dominates the market for middleware anyway with our WAS and WebSphere Application Server and WebSphere MQ and IIB applications. So it was a natural fit for us to acquire this organization to then help with the next stage of testing of those applications. And you'll be pleased to know that the Green Hat development team now sits directly in the same development lab as IBM's Hursley MQ middleware development team. So there's a huge center of excellence that IBM's now building. And the reason why this acquisition has been so successful is because the return on investment with service virtualization on a business level is so fantastic. A little bit very quickly about the kind of organizations who are adopting, have DevOps programs and are using service virtualization to optimize those DevOps programs. As with most technology, it starts off with the banks, but we now have a number of retailers using service virtualization from IBM. Utilities, they've got massive challenges now with rollouts of projects like Smart Meter. We also have some government organizations using it, and even areas like online gambling and organizations who are building mobile apps have the same sort of challenges. So those are the kind of organizations who are using it. If we're looking now at flipping to the slides now, as Stefan's already mentioned, it's a traditional way of doing testing is developers write their own individual unit tests on their own components, and they'll tend to hand program themselves a little framework to basically perform unit tests. And then as they move down the software development cycle, a lot of those assets will be kind of thrown away or remain on the developer's desktop. Then they'll perform some kind of service testing as they integrate the different components. And then that's when traditionally the testing team gets involved and UI testing is performed. And as Stefan has mentioned, with the DevOps world, it's all around being able to speed through this development cycle. And service virtualization, we should see as a technology which can enhance all of those existing processes throughout the development cycle and make it much more efficient and deliver real business value. I'm just moving to the next slide now. Developers have traditionally had very little access to test environments, and if they've tended to have to queue up with the QA teams to do that. And an organization has with an ecosystem of developers, testers, operations people, a lot of effort is spent building and maintaining basic stubs to do this. And what the IBM solution allows you to do is basically speed and improve a process which developers are already doing, but they're doing this by hand. And there's an awful lot of what we call finger pointing between the different areas. So the developers may require access to a particular test environment. Third parties might also need to test against it. The operations people have to maintain that test environment. When we get defects, we tend to find an awful lot of organizations, particularly in the development area, spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out where the defects are in that very complex environment, and that's where you get this kind of finger pointing between the development teams and the external companies as they try to triage and work out whose defect sits where. There's an awful lot of wastage in that development process. Moving to the next slide, and obviously when we come to the testing phase, as these developers have written these individual tests, a lot of them use things like SoapUI and open source frameworks. These are hand-coded by developers, and they're not used as assets throughout the development cycle. That's where you get this large amount of wastage. It's very difficult when you're hand programming and hand writing your own stubs and integration tests to work with realistic test data. And there's an awful lot of wastage there. The testers may then not use the stubs which are already been created by the developers, and those assets are not really realized and can't be part of the DevOps initiative. Just moving to the next slide. So I tend to use this example of, if hopefully you can all see the McLaren mid-90s McLaren supercar. The reason I use this diagram is it explains the current way a lot of people, before they adopt DevOps, are actually performing testing. So the McLaren supercar there, this is a prototype. If you imagine this is your highly mission critical software application. All of the components are bolted together. So in this case, obviously in the car analogy, we have the engine, which let's think of that as the database, and you have the wheels and the tires and the carburetor, and all of the components are all plugged together. Each individual piece of your development ecosystem will plug their own component into the prototype, and then it's handed over to the QA team to perform an end-to-end test. And this is what we're seeing now. We're doing an end-to-end test of the car, just like your quality assurance process. And what we have there is, in flames, is a defect. So if you multiply this by, 6 or 7 different release stages, you require 6 or 7 different prototypes, and then you find hundreds of different defects, and each one of those needs to be is represented by that fire, basically. So the challenge and the limiting factor with the DevOps process is that it's not scalable for the future. What we have, the first problem that we actually have, and this is particularly relevant with third-party components, using the example of McLaren, they've bought the carburetor from one company and the tires and the brakes from another company, maybe even the engine from another company. Everybody sits there scratching their heads, trying to work out where that defect was, and organizations at a business level are basically paying paying this ecosystem of developers and testers to figure out and triage where that defect is. That's the kind of as-is state that a lot of organizations find themselves in. What this actually means from a defect management point of view, if we use the left of this graph is the beginning of a project, and the right of the graph is obviously when we finish the testing and moving into production. Very little testing can be done early, and very few defects are actually found until you actually build your prototype and you plug all the components together. The defects go up and up and up, and then you perform retest cycles and triage and try to find a problem. Defects then come down through a very complex testing process, and then eventually you'll go live. And this is where this real wastage comes in, and this unscalability with a DevOps program. A significant percentage of that testing environment is basically finding fundamental defects which could have been found much earlier in the development cycle. And the other major wastage in that process is the triaging and localizing and trying to find which defect at the end user interface was actually caused by which component of your middleware. And the final area of wastage is in what we call test environment assurance, or dry running, or smoke testing, or some of our clients call it pipe cleaning, where you spend a quarter of each test cycle, maybe a 4-week test cycle. 1 week will be spent just making sure the environment is ready for doing testing before a huge test process starts. So very, very wasteful and not scalable for a DevOps strategy. If you look now, again, another example of fantastic British engineering, if you look at the way McLaren now test their supercars, and the reason why the Premier League footballers can now spend less time with their cars in the garage because they're tested in a much better way. And McLaren have this way of doing shift left and being able to test their cars and the components that they're getting from either third-party component suppliers, and in the case of software development teams, either third-party or in-house development teams, is they've already checked all of the components. They already know that the brakes will still work at 500 degrees when they've been driven for 24 hours in a straight line. They already know all those defects have already been eliminated. So what we're seeing here is an engineer explaining how they now do the testing, which is they build one individual prototype. The defects have already been found earlier. So all they're doing with the end-to-end test is really fine-tuning, polishing the application up. And as Stefan mentioned before, this is the first enabling way of making sure that your DevOps program and your speed of delivery is much quicker. What that actually creates from a defect management point of view is a way of shifting those defects to the left. So we perform testing throughout the development cycle, so we find a large amount of defects less at the end-to-end test, and that's the way that we can enable a DevOps program. Just for business people on the line who are interested in maybe paying the bills for your ecosystem of developers and third-party suppliers, I'd just like to use this analogy. If you think of the way the Industrial Revolution worked, right in the 1800s, the first steam train that was ever built, every single component was made by hand, and this is the way software development was in the 90s. Every single piece was made by hand. Every screwdriver was made. Every screw was made. The way the Industrial Revolution worked was the organizations then began to buy the tools and the components from third-party suppliers. And your developers here, if you look at the old-style drill that we've got, that's kind of version 2 or 3 of a drill that engineers will create. And software developers, like all engineers, they come up with problems and they solve those problems with their own little solution. What the IBM solution is allowing you to do, and what we're really talking about today, is to just, rather than having your developers handwrite these components and throw them away and try and improve them all the time, you as organizations have a DevOps initiative. You need to get applications out quicker. Let the developers spend their time innovating and creating fantastic software, IBM and its partners like Testhouse can then help you literally supply the tools so we can speed that process up. I just like to use that analogy to just at a very high level explain your developers and your ecosystem of third parties, they're already doing this. We've just got a way of making this quicker and better and more efficient. And as I mentioned before, what we're allowing you to do with Service Virtualization is to create integration tests throughout the development cycle. Every time anything new is plugged into it, each sprint flushes out its own defects if you're doing agile development, and you're not then paying for fixing components from third-party suppliers. A lot of third-party suppliers of components, payment systems, and databases and other components that you use, they're not always the angels that you might think they are, and even though you have a collaborative relationship with them, they can on occasions throw things over the wall to you as an organization, and you're kind of beta testing their software, which is not scalable. Service Virtualization gives you an ability to literally mark their homework as these components are delivered to you. And if they're breaking something, to highlight that to them very, very quickly. So then as we then move into the staging side of the software development, as your applications then move through development, through testing into staging, IBM's DevOps capabilities also move with you. So we have the integration testing for development and testing. And then in the staging environment, we also offer another acquisition, which is a solution called Urban Code, which will also guarantee that your test environment is exactly the same as your development environment, which is exactly the same as your pre-prod and your production environment. It governs that whole software development lifecycle process and ensures no errors are introduced. We have direct integrations between Service Virtualization and the release management and Urban Code capability from IBM, which means that you can execute integration tests as you move those applications through the staging environments into production to make sure that individual defects are not introduced as you move those applications through. This is an example of a typical environment. We're only using this slide just to highlight the sheer complexity that some of your organizations face. We have messages flying around from individual components into your middleware. Each of those messages, in theory, the IBM solution, we can record a message going from one component to another, record the response coming back, and as I mentioned before, your developers are already doing this, but they're just doing this by hand. We can make these recordings very intelligent. The power of the integration tests we can create is incredibly apt and useful for things like DevOps. We can make these recordings very powerful and show you exactly which component is broken in a very complex architecture like this. We can then, using the same assets that we've created, these recordings and these integration tests, we can then stub out a component. So, for example, your ETL tool in the bottom right-hand of the corner may not be available, or it may be being upgraded. The DevOps requirement is that you continue your testing throughout the development cycle. So we don't want the lack of availability of that ETL tool to then somehow stop your DevOps initiative and stop your testing. So we can literally just stub out that component and your testing of the end-to-end process can continue. And this is part of the way that we can alleviate these bottlenecks. And again, as I mentioned before, your user interface testing, which tends to happen right at the end of the development cycle, will be trying to create complex testing scenarios at the user interface that can then be checked against. By being able to mock out and record these integration points and then stub out individual components, we can ensure that your ability to continue to test the user interface is not affected by a piece of the application which is broken. So in this system, we can drive the user interface, check what the expected outcome is, and then have the ability to actually check an individual component and triage those defects rather than waiting for them to be found at the user interface level, and then triage the defects through this very complex process of each developer looking through log files and trying to blame somebody else. Well, my message went from my component to the next component, so it must be your problem. And you as an organization, as a business person, having to pay for the privilege of this back and forward between the different third parties. And in this example here, we can even record the messages between individual components, so nothing to do with the graphical user interface. Your testing team can now enhance its skills and be able to test individual components without the requirement for waiting to do the graphical user interface, the user interface testing. So where we actually are able to record those integration messages, create integration tests and stubs, is not just limited to activities on the user interface. We can literally test every single one of those components, and that will massively enhance your ability to realize your DevOps process. So as I mentioned before, we can, using this very clever recording technology, and if anybody's interested in more detail about how this works, the guys from Testhouse can explain this in much more detail if once people are interested in taking a further look at it. But we can inject message data into a particular recording point. We can decide exactly where in this complex infrastructure we actually record our messages and where we create our mocks, and that's all configurable within the tool. If your developers were trying to do this kind of thing by hand using their own program versions of the drill that I mentioned before, it would be incredibly difficult to do. And this is the whole value that the Testhouse and IBM solution around DevOps and integration testing can help you with. We can literally record any one of those messages anywhere in this infrastructure. And then as messages, we can fire one message into a particular integration point. Various messages will then fly out into other parts of your infrastructure. And then we can literally fire one message in and then record and correlate every single message which leaves using this very clever proxy technology. And then from that, we can look at exactly where defects might manifest themselves, rather than, as I mentioned before, and Stefan has talked about, you wait until the end of the development cycle to find these defects. And as I mentioned before, our ability to then take those integration tests and convert the integration tests into stubs to mimic another component automatically is the exact value that we're giving, without your developers having to do all this by hand, tinkering around with proxies and trying to work out where they can actually use mock services and handwritten stubs that they write themselves. All of this can be controlled and managed automatically through the IBM and Testhouse solution. So as I mentioned before, if we look at these three diagrams here, what we actually have is one component in the middle that we actually are building, a particular developer is building, and then we can mock out all the four services and test our individual component. And then as the different components are built, and this is where the DevOps process comes in, your ability to develop things in parallel and test them in parallel, as the individual components are then actually deployed and delivered to you, we can then switch off the virtualization components and then test using the actual components that you have. This is a list of the kind of technologies that we actually support. So this covers most of the major technologies which your developers are using from a middleware level. So as you can see, we have a number of message protocols, and that extends from your standard HTTPS, standard web technologies, REST interfaces, JMS. I don't want to go too much into the technology, as this is a business call, to things like Software AG Web Methods and SAP, TIBCO, IBM's WebSphere MQ. And then we can support, we create our integration tests and our mock services in exactly the same way in every single one of those types of message protocols. You may even decide to swap from a commercial integration bus into a more open source or free, lower cost middleware provider. The integration tests you've already created and the stubs you've already created can just be converted from one type of technology to another. So it gives you this ability to stop working with one type of technology because you may not have skills for it and move to another type of technology using the same integration tests and stubs. And on the right hand side you can see, for any of you in the financial services area and also in kind of logistics area, there's a number of pre-created message formats that we use. There's a lot of effort which IBM has put into support the main technologies which you as organizations are using. So in this, a lot of our clients have quite interesting challenges when financial people are involved in an investment like this. What I'm showing here is a specific return on investment we did for a major European bank. So with any DevOps type project and any integration testing type project, we were, accountancy and finance people were particularly interested in what the ROI basically was. And this is not an IBM survey, this is an independent survey which was done on a particular major European bank. And these are some of the benefits they managed to realize. So within 3 years, they increased the amount of projects they could deliver by 100%. And that was from 40 projects to 80 projects because of our ability to find these defects earlier. There were some major production defects which we managed to uncover. So as applications move from the staging and into the production environment, we're able to reduce those massive incidents from 2.5 incidents average per project down to one incident per 3 projects. And then shifting the defects to the left earlier, that because developers triaging defects by hand tends to be a massive cost. Developers tend to be the most expensive resource in any development organization. This organization found a cost saving of over $500,000 just in finding those defects early on, the concept of shift left. And then again, some of you are actually using third-party feeds. A lot of your third-party suppliers will charge you for testing fees. And again, this organization had credit checking testing fees, and we managed to eliminate all of those costs just by mocking out them. This is a specific use case from a Canadian bank, Bank of Montreal. These are the kind of benefits which they were able to deliver. So 51 to 75% accelerated project delivery and 25% reduction in defects in production. And that's an independent survey which was done by Tech Validate, a user story around IBM. For any of you organizations who are not involved in financial services, this is a CocaCola company. We're able to reduce similar types of levels, 25 to 50% decrease in defects in production. This was a major rollout of an upgrade of a massive SAP-based enterprise resource planning application. They were able to achieve some fantastic benefits.
Thank you, Nick, for the presentation and the details you provided on service virtualization. I think it highlighted a lot of key elements to the audience today, and thank you so much for your time. Now it's time to conclude the formal part of the presentation in regard to DevOps and service virtualization. So what did we understand today, and what is the takeaway? Is for the DevOps benefits, there is faster, cost-efficient software feature release. There is more stable operational environment, production of higher quality products with more value to your customer. And also it involved to move from a silo approach to collaboration, which will increase iteration, improving, discussing, and redefining at a more rapid pace to enable to bring product faster to your client needs. The biggest challenges that we hear when we speak with medium to large organizations in regard to DevOps adoption is the sheer resistance to changes, and the tone has to come from the top. If the top is not fully agreeable to it, there is low chance that the company will make a turn toward that direction, and not making the turn mean that you can be left behind compared to your competition. The fear of the unknown is the other thing. Also regarding the sheer resistance to changes, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge is not only about the tool set. The tool set, there are several tools there, but the biggest issue will come from business transformation, IT transformation, and mostly from people, because people will have to change their habit, the way they work. They will have to retrain, and sometimes they will need to change pay packages. And people weren't used not to work together, and sometimes maybe hating each other, like from operation to DevOps to dev people or testing people, will have to start working together better. And these may be on different pay scale and different issues arise over the year. So there may be some political issues. So these are all reasons why they could be a challenge to organization. And this is somewhere that organization who have done it before or consulting like Testhouse and IBM can assist you to go through that process, since we have seen it elsewhere. The lack of time of transformation, like I hear that so often, like people are saying, we're too busy, we don't have time to do any transformation or any changes. And business interruption, is it going to affect our delivery process? So there is a way to work around it, and we can certainly suggest different way to do it. Business cases to justify financially the funding, and we have all the tools for the ROI and build the business cases to convince management to be able to get their full support and understand the step going forward without business interruption. The DevOps require continuous testing, which is the key messages for today, and that will require test automation and continuous testing. But also part of that, if you have a complex testing environments, using technologies such as Service Virtualization can enable you to develop product faster and be able to test them earlier without having to wait for services or having to pay for these services when you access them. And that is all good for velocity. And the biggest word to remember, DevOps adoption rise rapidly. Unless organization act on it, you're at risk to be left behind and lose your market to more agile competitors. Like, think of the Uber of this world. Like, look what they are happening there are with many other organizations who are moving extremely fast, doing several releases a week or a month. Business model changes, and it's very important to adapt your business model based on your client needs. Otherwise, other organizations may want to access these clients. So for the next part, we will be introducing a bit what is Testhouse and how we can help. So to do that, I will introduce Shug Suhadevan, who is our CEO and founder at Testhouse, and I will let him continue for the next two slides.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is, Stefan said, is Shug Suhadevan. I am very pleased to be able to speak to you, and I'm extremely grateful that you found the time to join our webinar today. And on the slide, the first thing that we say on there is the IBM Premier Business Partner, because that is a very important relationship that we hold, and a good relationship basically around the DevOps and the Service Virtualization area. And we're continuing to do good things together for the customers in the marketplace. The only thing I would say is that I'm more of a Aston Martin fan, but after hearing Nick talk about McLaren, I might even consider one of those. Not that I can afford it. The company itself, Testhouse, was founded in 2000, and we focused on software testing services. We don't do development, we don't do support, we don't do anything else but QA and testing. And with that motto, we continued. In the initial stages, we had customers who were not doing any testing at all, whether it's manual, automation, nothing at all, just taking it from development into production, to customers who were starting to become mature. And so we were helping customers improve their software quality across the board. And as things developed within the marketplace, we have to keep abreast of what's going on, because we're consultants and we have to advise customers of the latest in technology and advancements. So things moved on from the initial stages of just manual testing to then automation, then performance testing, and then continued on to agile development methodologies, and now moving on to DevOps and shift left. So we have to be aware of what's going on, and we have to inform you as customers of our findings as well, which is what we're doing here today. We're headquartered in London with regional offices worldwide. So we have full delivery centers out of the UK, out of India, and in Dubai. Round about 210 or so staff at the moment. We provide on-site and onshore and offshore testing services. So if customers are requiring for us to do some manual testing or automation or performance, we can take them offshore. I will just move to the next slide. Right, it just goes a little bit more onto our services, and again, we talk about the strategic guidance. So we are talking to a fairly big car manufacturer at the moment in advising them on how they could improve their quality within the organization. They have disparate manufacturing and IT organizations across the globe, and they don't have a standardized approach to QA. So we're in there helping them, guiding them on that practice. We do managed testing services for customers who need the whole of the testing outsourced to somebody like us, where we have people onshore working with the team as test managers or team leads, with our offshore team providing the soldiers from India. We provide, obviously, the functional testing and the non-functional testing. I think that's all relatively straightforward, and we provide training in test processes and techniques. The only thing that I'd like to add to today is to say that this is the presentation today was mostly around the business side of DevOps and Service Virtualization. And I'm sure that we are doing one on the technical side of it, which I will encourage people to join in, for you to fully understand the complexity and the benefits that Service Virtualization brings. I remember that I was working on, as a developer, on a communications protocol, and I had to write stubs to test that. This was a fairly long time ago, before SV was even a glimmer of a design. But at that time, I realized that it is very important to have simulators to be able to test systems for yourselves. And I see SV as more of a configurable simulator, but with a lot more complexity and advantage to the business. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I'll hand it back to Stefan.
Thank you, Shuk, for presenting Testhouse and your vision about DevOps and Service Virtualization. Now, for the next part of the presentation is just to let you know that these documents are available online, and you'll get, everybody on the line will get a copy of the presentation in the days to come. But you can go to that website and you can download these booklets about DevOps for Dummies and Service Virtualization for Dummies, which are a great book, very well written, to give a good introduction on the technology and how it is being used and what are the benefits. Coming up, as Shuk suggested, is we have the next webinar, which will be more technical. Of interest will be that we have our CTO, Chief Technology Officer, who is a subject matter expert in automation and into DevOps, who will do that part. And we'll have Max Parker, which is a guru in UK for IBM, who will do the technical presentation and some demonstration of the technology. And this is coming up in 2 weeks from now, so feel free to join us or to invite your colleagues or your network to join you. So this concludes our presentation today. Now let's see if we have any questions from the audience. We have quite a few. Nick, would you like to take a few of these questions? We have about 5 or 6 of them who came in.
Yeah, sure. So I've got, looking at one there, my development and testing are outsourced, including test environments. Our organization is mainly governance of contractors and suppliers. I guess it's their responsibility to decide what they wish to use to meet quality and delivery KPIs. So yeah, that's a really interesting question. What the IBM capability and any DevOps initiative which you do, what you're going to require is ability to mark the homework of those third-party suppliers. So it's a classic governance problem that this organization has. If the testing infrastructure development is all outsourced, that's where you end up with this conflict with everybody pointing fingers to each other and you as the client paying for the privilege of these guys trying to figure out where the defect is and everybody blaming each other. That can be very, very time-consuming and expensive. And developers, particularly when you have specific types of developers, they can do what we call gold plating of their work. So you might ask them to, for an integration point which does X, Y, and Z, but they might make it more complicated, which may introduce defects. And again, we can govern that process and make sure that all of the component suppliers are not charging you for doing work that's just sugarcoating their resume or their CV for the next job that they might want to do, and direct them to the real challenge. I've got another question here. How do you justify an investment in integration testing and service virtualization, especially when we're in the middle of a development cycle? So my comment to that is really the way that you perform an ROI with service virtualization is in three main areas. The first one is the amount of developers' time which is being wasted creating their own individual unit tests. So we've seen situations in financial services, just an example, where developers would literally spend 3 days creating an integration test and a stub for something very complicated. We can do that in 20 minutes in some situations, just recording and working with the message and making the stubs very, very powerful. And then we obviously have the massive advantage that integration test and stub is not then thrown away. Once the developer's finished with it, it's moved through the development cycle. So that's the first development effort, is the first component of the return investment. And we have test environment costs, so we can, through very clever technology, which is it's too much detail to bore the executives on today, we can allow you to have multiple projects, developers, testers, multiple third parties all sharing one test environment. And that allows you to eliminate this kind of waiting for test environments and resetting them all the time. That's a very clever technology IBM's developed called Sift and Pass-Through, which Max Parker will be showing next week. And then the final piece of the return investment.
Yeah, Nick, last question for you. And we'll need to close on that because we're out of time. But one question that comes often from the market is, what is the difference between virtual machine application virtualization and service virtualization? And there is some confusion out there about it. Can you try to put some light about the difference in these three expressions?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, virtualizing of applications and putting them using solutions like SoftLayer from IBM or VMware VM images, that's literally what we call orchestration. So it's just putting the images onto machines. And some organizations their operations team have come up with a way of doing that, and that's absolutely great. What our solution allows us to do, and some clients believe that service virtualization is probably the wrong word. That's the word the market has given it. It's more like service simulation. We're actually looking at the integration point. So this is a software problem, not an image on a piece of hardware, on a piece of tin problem that we're actually solving. So it's part of a DevOps process. It's part of a testing optimization process, and it's part of a middleware development process, nothing to do with orchestrating and putting images onto machines.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. So that concludes today's presentation for the webinar. Thank you all for attending. You will be receiving in the next few seconds a survey for today that will take no more than 1 minute to complete. So I would appreciate your time to complete it, because that will enable us to improve webinar going forward and be ready for the next one coming up in 2 weeks from now. Going forward, Testhouse is doing regular webinar to inform the community about various needs in the area of testing. So feel free to consult our website regarding these upcoming events touching various technologies and various topics, including DevOps and performance testing and today is Service Virtualization, and many more to come. So thank you all for attending today, and have a pleasant day, and looking forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks from now. Thank you.